Steve Pound, Labour Member of Parliament for Ealing North. We have a friendship group between Armenian parliamentarians and British parliamentarians, and we visit quite regularly. I visited Armenia twice in the last 12 months. I've been there over 5 times. And it's very, very important for a range of reasons. Firstly, parliaments should speak to parliaments, and a crucial country like Armenia, which is a beacon of stability in the South Caucasus, and has always been one of the crossroad nations. It's the nation which is actually at the heart of so many different movements. We must have close relations with them.
When was the first time that you heard the word Armenia ever? And how did you come to know this country? How did you get interested in it?
I mean, it's interesting. The first time I ever heard the word Armenia when I was at school, and I was told that Armenia in the year 301 was the first ever Christian country on earth. And that impressed me, but I wanted to know where Armenia was, or who were the Armenians, who are these people? And at that time, the most famous Armenian in this country was a man called Kalus Gulbenkian. Everybody knew Gulbenkian, although we had had Michael Arlen, who was an extremely famous writer, been there before I was born. But all I knew about Armenia was that it was a country that seemed to be kept getting invaded, it was constantly being occupied, and yet it had never, ever ceased to be Armenia. And it didn't seem to matter what happened, Armenia was unbreakable. And that was incredibly emotive and moving and powerful to me. And interestingly enough, a lot of my friends who are Polish and Irish feel the same way about Armenians. They feel they're small countries that have been occupied, but the essential quality remains the same. But then, like everybody else, the more times you visit Armenia, the more Armenians you meet, the more you look at Armenian literature, Armenian music, Armenian food, maybe even Armenian brandy, the harder it is to ever think of yourself as anything other than a real friend of Armenia.
Can you recall your first visit or another remarkable visit to Armenia and stories or places that you have been?
Well, the first time I visited Armenia was about 10 years ago, and I went to Artsakh, to Nagorno-Karabakh. And that was a political statement. I wanted to go there because I felt that what was happening at the time, the cross-border incursions, obviously from the Azeris, were so dangerous and so destabilising that it was important that British parliamentarians actually visited, and also to see for ourselves, because there was a propaganda war being raged in this country. So I went there, and I have this marvellous visa stamped in my passport, my Nagorno-Karabakh visa, which sadly means I can never ever go to Azerbaijan, but I will have to live with that. And so there we flew into Yerevan, and in those days, I'm talking about quite a long time ago, used to have to fly through Air Austria, through Vienna, and then fly into Yerevan, and then get a long, long journey for the best part of a day by some pretty dangerous roads high up on the hills. And then suddenly, this incredible landscape opens up before you. This beautiful, pristine, green, glorious, great landscape of rolling hills. And you think, where am I? What is this country? I mean, it looks like sort of Switzerland with sunshine, and it's just incredible. And then so I arrived at Stepanakert, and I saw a modern city. And I just thought, this is absolutely amazing. And then when I went to Sochi later, which was the Paris of the South Caucasus in the 1890s, we had more opera houses, more theatres than certainly anywhere outside Paris. And I said, why doesn't the whole world know about this? This is just the most stunning, staggering country. And yet the people I spoke to at the time were still bruised by the war. And when I went to Sochi, I was walking along the edge of the cliff where the Armenians had climbed up, if you remember. Shushi, and there under my feet were the bullets. You could still see the bullet, and when I went there last year, there are still some there because so much fighting took place. And when you go to Sochi, at the actual site of the battle, there's an old Soviet graveyard there with the red stars on it. So I learnt a little bit, about the history of this country. I learned how, people who like Mikoyan and people who you'd thought of as Russian were actually Armenia, and so many other stories of the hidden history. But everybody I've ever met who's been to Armenia is changed. I've never met anyone who's been there and come back and said, oh, it's just another country. Never.
What is it that changed you in the way? Was it the Karabakh that you have just told us?
It was the Karabakh issue that actually inspired me to visit for the first time, because it seemed wrong.
And you spoke about propaganda that's here in Western countries. What is it that you saw back over there that was different from the propaganda, in stark contrast of more people here.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The propaganda war is actually fought by an organisation called TEAS, T-E-A-S, which is the European Azerbaijani Society. Now, they are very wealthy, they have a lot of money, and they send out this very, very glossy magazine. And the propaganda that they state is that on both sides of the line there are sort of displaced persons, people living in refugee camps. And yet when I was in Stefanica, with my own eyes, underneath this, the famous statue, the mother and the father, the grandfather,
yes.
That famous, what do you say in Armenian?
Dadik Papik.
Dadik Papik, it's a daddy and mummy.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the one, as you say.
Yes.
And just down from there, all these houses were being built.
Yes.
And so if a poor country like Armenia can build it, why on earth are Azeris not building for their people? Why are they still intense? So to actually see that, and also to walk around and chat to people, with a good interpreter, and because I was told that Nagorno-Karabakh was an occupied territory. Well, everybody I spoke to said, no, we're Armenian. Of course we're Armenian. And the Armenian flag that they fly there has a break across the corner, so it's not joined together.
Yes.
And I think that was very, very symbolic. The thing that stuns me when I visit Armenia is to look at the antiquity of it. To go to the oldest church on earth, the oldest Christian church on earth,
Right.
by far, in Exmiadzin, which is by far, and to see that, the antiquity of it all,
Yes.
to see the cross stones, and to see the churches with the steps outside. And also because the food, the drink, the music, it was pure Armenian. But it also had that unique Armenian quality about it, where life wasn't particularly good, but on the other hand, it could still be enjoyed. And I seem to remember when I was there, I was being introduced to something called mulberry vodka, which comes in a bottle. It has a wooden cork, and once you've taken it out, you can't put it back in again.
Okay, yeah.
Yes. And so we had some good times. The issue of Nagorno-Karabakh is crucial and important to all Western nations, to all nations today, partly because it was the single most awful consequence of the collapse of the Soviet Union, of all the wars that took place, and all the wars that are still continuing. If you think of Chechnya, maybe what's happening in Ukraine, maybe what's happening in Donetsk, all the dreadful problems, that was the single most bloody and most awful one, because Nagorno-Karabakh was forcibly contained within the area by Stalin, who would have hoped as a Georgian would have had a bit more sympathy, but clearly didn't. And also the fact that Azerbaijan is an Azeri country who speak the same language as the Turks. It is a Turkic language. Therefore, many, many people in their folk memories felt there was a great deal of similarity between the past. But also because you had a people who were quintessentially Armenian.
Yeah.
And you have to allow people the privilege of being where they want to be, and they wanted to be in Armenia. But it's important partly because Armenia won, because, against all the odds. When the Russians left Azerbaijan, they left an armoured division's worth of equipment behind, an entire armoured division. At one stage, the Armenian Air Force consisted of 1 helicopter and 2 MiG training aircraft. 2! And if you think about all the volunteers that the Azeris weren't flying their own planes. They were bringing in people from Ukraine, people from, who were flying. And they had, with all that equipment, with actually, a full tank division's worth of kit. And they were beaten by a group of people, with Kalashnikovs and homemade rifles. And even in the museums I've been, homemade hand grenades and mines. It's pretty incredible. And I think sometimes it's the courage of a people that actually overcomes it. I referred to Poland earlier on. When Russia invaded Poland in the 1930s, the Polish cavalry charged the tanks. And it's a similar, there's a little bit of a read across that. But it's also important because it's a failure of modern diplomacy. The Minsk process is frozen at the present time. And, the main negotiating countries, obviously being France and Russia, are not getting any traction. We're not moving forward. Now, that wouldn't matter if the status quo was stable, but it isn't. Stefanica Airport cannot open, and as long as Stefanica Airport will not open, Artsakh will not be able to flourish. But even more dangerously, there are people shooting across the line at the present time. There is border incursions going on, so it's not a cold war, it's a hot war. It may be frozen in Minsk, but it's very hot on the border. And we can't allow that. We cannot have young people in what I think of as a European country. I think of Armenia as European. I'm sorry. I know it's Caucasian. I know it is older than Europe. But I feel European when I'm in Yerevan and I'm talking to people. When I just feel, the art, the culture, the music, to me it feels European. But anyway,
Okay.
I am European, so you can't. But you cannot allow a situation today in the 21st century where people are shooting across the border and killing people. And when I've been in Artsakh, I've actually seen the Katusha missiles that were sent over. And you know what a Katusha, it's great, long, thin. I actually saw one sticking out of the wall of a monastery. Yeah, indeed, but this is a monastery, a place of God, and there's a missile sticking out of the wall. We can't have that.
Yes, but it is predominantly because of the attitude and the mindset of the Azerbaijan, which wants to take back not only territories, but Nagorno-Karabakh as such. So, can you say a little bit about this, because this is the main danger we're having?
I know. I don't want to be offensive to people, but Azerbaijan is a failed state. It is a state which is run on corruption. It is a state that is immensely rich, but it is utterly corrupt at every level, from the president to the president's family. They are very keen to have big publicity coups like staging the Eurovision Song Contest, and every British Member of Parliament is invited out there on a regular basis. Would you please come? Oddly enough, not me, but most British members of Parliament. And people who've gone there, they are given watches, they are looked after, Now, I try to understand the patriotism, because if I can be patriotic, Azeris can be patriotic. But they've got more important things to do than to worry about Artsakh. They have real difficulties of corruption within their own country, real difficulties. And power supply and energy security is a huge issue. They are an oil-rich country at the present time. America is now self-sufficient. America doesn't have to buy any oil. Hydraulic fracturing is actually providing a source of energy in a way that oil used to. So a lot of countries which are oil-rich, living on petrodollars, are having to say to themselves, well, 2 or 3 years' time, people aren't going to be buying it. Yeah. What do we do? What Azerbaijan should be doing is building up its other industry. It used to have a shipbuilding industry. It used to have a fishing industry. It's quite strategically well placed on the edge of the Caspian there. But instead of worrying about Armenia and going on and on and on about these dreadful, awful Armenian people, they should actually look at their own reflection in the mirror and sort that out. So one of the reasons why, in my opinion, it carries on is that where you have a country which is a failed state, the easiest thing to do is to choose an enemy outside. Napoleon, when we had problems within France, he would always create the great cry of La patrie en danger. The country's in danger, it's those beastly Brits or Russians or Prussians or something. And it's a very easy thing to do. If your country is corrupt and rotten, you can say, oh yes, but it's not us, it's those people out there. And the idea of Armenia being an aggressor nation, I find particularly bizarre. But on the other hand, Azerbaijan, which jails dissidents, which has no free press, has absolute utter censorship, they find it easier to say, well, never mind, don't look inwards, look outwards, look at those awful Armenians across the border. I think that the current military threat from Azerbaijan is real, but I don't think it's sustainable. I do not think, and again, I've been to the defense ministry in Armenia. I've actually spoken to some pretty senior generals. I've been to their training colleges. It's a pretty good army, a pretty sensible army, and also actually generating their own materiel. Now they're not just having to import stuff; they actually got their own artillery, and so no, I find it's cool. But of course, a country will do that, so you don't rely on other people. The idea of a military invasion across the border from Baku, I don't think is feasible. Quite simply because when you're playing chess with Armenia, and Armenia is one of the great chess-playing countries on earth, you are playing against chessboard with 2 queens on the chessboard. One is Armenia, the other is the diaspora. The diaspora is the second queen. Look what happened in the war. Lebanon sent a brigade. People came from Cyprus, people came from America. If you look at the people who fought in Shushi, who were they? A lot of them weren't from Yerevan or from Stefanica. Many of them were, but equally people came from the diaspora. That is the second queen on the chessboard. And you can't beat anyone who's got 2 queens on the chessboard. I don't care what you say.
You have raised the question of Armenian genocide recognition in Parliament in the UK. What was it that convinced you personally that the Armenian genocide did take place and that the truth is on our side?
I find it stunning to think that anyone can be a denier of that. And I actually have a lot of sympathy for the current Turkish government, because they're not the Ottoman Empire, they're not the Ottoman government. And the present Turkish government didn't do it. And if you look at Orhan Pamuk and some of the famous Turkish writers who actually say, look, this did happen, what possible good can it be do in denying it? And they then get attacked for it. I mean, I have some sympathy, but if you read the Blue Book, the Bryce Toynbee report, now I have a copy there on my shelf, I have the new edition that's just come out. Bryce Toynbee is a cool, cold, dispassionate, empirical analysis of what happened. And the people who are the American ambassador is giving information, German missionaries are giving information, and it's all in immense detail. Every single vilayet is listed, the number of people who lived there before the genocide, and also when the genocide actually started in Istanbul. And as ever in these cases, it's the intellectuals that went first. The people who were first killed were Armenian doctors, and so many Armenian soldiers who were officers in the Ottoman army. They were also hanged. We know, I mean, I don't wish to go into details, but that's when it started, and then it spread right the way through Anatolia. You can't possibly deny that, and it's indisputable that Western Armenians, who had their own language, their own culture, who were massively embedded in the local community, were very often the civic leaders. They were politicians, they were soldiers, they were doctors. They were the people who were leading the community. Aren't there now. Their churches are there now. Their memory is there now. And in some cases, their bones are there now. So how can you possibly deny it? And when I hear people say, oh, it was the Russians or the Armenians were secretly attacking I mean, that is just nonsense. I'm sorry. You cannot... Look, if my country had committed a crime, I wouldn't deny it. Because it is one thing to try to kill a people. And don't forget, this was the 5th time that there'd been a genocide of the Armenians. The 5th time. It goes right back to the 1870s. To do that is harsh and cruel. But to deny that you did it, that is a double cruelty. So when I talk to Armenians whose grandparents or great-grandparents died in the genocide, they suffer and they're hurting. But when they are told that it is denied that that happened, when it is their blood that died, that is a double cruelty. And no British parliamentarian can possibly be anything other than utterly ashamed of that period and determined to actually expose it. We didn't do enough at the time, but Bryce Toynbee, Lord Bryce and Arnold Toynbee's report is still the finest piece of work written on the subject. And I think that's in some way that this country made reparations for its lack of advice and assistance at the time. And in a tiny little way, when I can continue to raise the issue and also discuss the Minsk process and where we are with the negotiations over Artsakh, then I think I owe it, as everybody in this Parliament does, to those people who we didn't help in 1915. And it's also very, very interesting. You must have been to the Genocide Museum in Yerevan. I mean, the first time I visited it, I was so overcome with emotion I could hardly look at the exhibits because it's almost too much. And so I went down to the Eternal Flame and I laid the flowers, and then well, to be honest, I said a prayer and left. The second time and the third time I went, I actually looked at all the illustrated London news, the magazines, the books. And then you realise there were huge numbers of Armenian refugees that came to this country who were raising money for that. Oh, yes. Yeah, for that particular period. And the links were very, very, very close. But there's an incredible amount of documentation. So if not Gladstone, I mean, many, many other people, like Lord Bryce, and like today, Lord Avebury in the House of Lords.
Yes,
and Lord Avebury and I presented a petition to Downing Street in which he said in German the famous words of Hitler, if you remember, when someone said, who now remembers the Armenians? And we stood there on the steps of Downing Street and said, we remember the Armenians, and we will never forget the Armenians.
Yeah. What are the arguments against recognizing genocide?
Well, well, you ask me an impossible question because I disagree with it. The first time I raised it, and it was during the Labour government, and Jeff Hoon was the Foreign Office Minister who answered, who's no longer in the House. And he said, we cannot call it genocide because the word genocide didn't exist in 1915. He said the word genocide first appears anywhere in the world in 1945 to describe the actions of Nazi Germany and the genocide of the Jews. And I said, well, the fact that the word wasn't used doesn't mean it didn't happen. I'm not sure you have a word for murder, but it still is. The genocide means the killing of a nation, of a race. Homicide kills a man, fratricide kills a brother, and so on. Patricide kills your father. Genocide is a genus, a people. And you cannot deny for a second that what happened was a systematic attempt by the most senior Ottoman politicians to wipe out the Armenian people, partly to get their land, partly because they were perceived as being more successful than other people, partly because there was a paranoia that somehow they might support the Russians in their attack on Turkey, but ultimately in the same way that they had done 4 times before, because this most successful community was almost offensive to some Ottomans because they were doing so well. And it was similar to Idi Amin in Uganda in 1973 with the Indians who had gone there and become so successful. That it's an easy way to say these people have been taking advantage of us. I mean, to look at Armenian culture in Anatolia before 1915 is to look at an incredibly sophisticated and advanced culture. A literature, and it amazes me to this day, I know people who use the word Armenian to mean bookseller. If you go to Kolkata, where there's a huge Armenian quarter.
To mean bookseller?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
To this day, you have an Armenian quarter in Calcutta, and it's mostly carpets. They're selling carpets. But if you then say to someone, they use this word, and I said, what's that word mean? They said, oh, it means bookseller. It's the same word, it's Armenian. Because Armenians were the people who sold the books, because they are the people of the book. And as you know, in the Manuscript Museum, I mean, what a stunning place. Yeah. So that is this incredible culture, and that was the culture that the Ottoman Empire sought to destroy. The fact that you are here today, the fact that Armenia is here today, means that they failed, but we will not succeed until we have got a proper recognition of the genocide and a proper understanding and acceptance. You can't underestimate the Armenians, because even with most of Western Armenia suffered the appalling, brutal genocide of 1915, still they survived. And for me, one of the stories absolutely typifies the incredible courage and bravery and unbreakable quality of the Armenians was the bird's nest. Now this was, as you know, many of the young boys and girls whose parents were victims of the genocide went to Lebanon because France, who controlled Lebanon, was very, very supportive, much more, if I may say, than Great Britain was at the time. And many parents died, particularly crossing the desert in Syria, so that their children could live. And they arrived in this huge orphanage in northern Lebanon, which the French call the bird's nest, because it's full of the little chicks. And in the 1930s, the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, the man who Rastafarians still look as the sort of founder of their religion, who was then the greatest Christian emperor in Africa, was paying a visit to Lebanon, and he suddenly heard this amazing music coming from round the corner. And round comes this Armenian boys' marching band. There's about 70 or 80 boys playing French musical instruments, bugles, trumpets, euphoniums, drums, playing this incredible music. And he said, who are they? And the guy said, well, they are the Armenian boys. They said, well, what are they doing here? And they said, their parents were killed. They're here. When the French withdrew after the First War, they left a lot of musical instruments, just as they did in Mexico. And in Mexico, you have a sort of music which derives from that military music. In Lebanon, the Armenian kids started playing this incredible music. So Haile Selassie said, look, I've got a big country. Would any of them like to come to live in Ethiopia? So the Armenians took a vote, and 300 or 400 of them decided they would. And so a ship left Beirut to Addis Ababa overland. Well, next thing you know is that they've intermarried because it's 2 Christian countries. But incredibly, Armenian music and French military music and African music has come together to create the best jazz in the world. And in the 1950s, the center of jazz was not America, it was not St. Louis, not Kansas City, it wasn't New York, it was Addis Ababa. And you read anything about Charlie Parker and Ornette Coleman, Coleman Hawkins, Dizzy Gillespie, any of the great musicians, they talk about what happened in Ethiopia. And you go there today, you'll still see, Petrosian and Navassian, there are these centres up there. So what this says to me is you've got young people whose parents are being killed, who've suffered the most brutal genocide, certainly the first and worst genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century. And instead of just suffering and just, they actually get on with it. They say there's some musical instruments there, and they create this incredible art form. And there are today Armenians in Ethiopia who've married local women, and it's now the second and third generation. I mean, what other country on earth could do that? What other country? It's unbelievable. But it's unbelievable. It's also Armenian.
You spoke about the importance of recognizing genocide. Why is it important for the Western governments to recognize it, and what are the next steps?
If the argument is that you must only do one thing, then you can say, of course, Nagorno-Karabakh is important, of course the economy is important, of course the diaspora is important, mineral extraction in Armenia, the future of the country, they're all important. But you don't have to do one thing and not another. Yeah. You can do all of them, and as far as I'm concerned, modern Armenia, which is a very new country after all, modern Armenia, to take its place in the world, has to be comfortable with itself and has to understand the respect that the other nations give it. Now, there is a theory that a lot of the Armenian diaspora are united more than anything by the campaign, where in this country we have an organisation called CRAG, Campaign for the Recognition of Armenian Genocide, CRAG, and you'll find the same thing in Modesto, the same thing in many other countries and parts. Yeah. But does it matter? In this country we've just commemorated the outbreak of the First World War, which happened in 1914. Every single church, every single community, every single part of this country held services to commemorate the war of 1914. Yes. Why? Because we must make sure it never happens again. We have to commemorate, not just to pay respect for the dead, but also to say that we've moved on. So to commemorate and recognize the genocide of 1915 is not just respectful to Armenian people. Well, after all, many Armenians have lost relatives in the genocide. Yeah. I know many Armenians who can trace their families back to missing grandparents or various other people like that. It's also that, but it's also because we can't allow countries to do that. Since the Armenian genocide, we've had the Nazi genocide, we've had Rwanda, we've had other awful example, and we may be seeing something approaching genocide in northern Iraq today. The minute we deny genocide, we do a disservice to all those modern victims of genocide. And this came up very much in the Balkans, during the dreadful war there, when people talked about, yet again, is this the genocide of a people? And we have to know the past to make the future better. The reparation issue is entirely valid and fair. Look, if Poland can get reparations from Germany and Austria, which it did, I mean, I remember very much indeed, 1998, 1999, I was part of that process, and when Austria and Germany both agreed, this was for forced labourers. What happened towards the end of the war, a lot of young Polish people were shipped from Poland mostly to Bavaria and made to work on farms. They were not paid. Yeah, exactly. A lot of Polish land was expropriated. Yeah. And Germany and Austria created a fund of reparation for that, which is absolutely right, because it gives you closure. Yeah. It means that Poland can now be at peace with Germany. Never mind what happened before. They've accepted it, they've apologised for it, and they've made reparation. If modern Turkey could do the same thing, then I think that would bring a measure of peace and satisfaction to Armenia. Ultimately, I mean, when I visited Western Armenia, as I still think of it, I would love to see those villages occupied again, particularly around Lake Van. That's areas where they're so Armenian. Whether that's going to happen again or not, I don't know. But I think reparations are very, very important because they are a symbolic, not a symbolic, so they're an actual physical demonstration. And I just quote the example of Poland. If Germany can do it, if Austria can do it, I think Turkey can. Yeah. The question about modern Armenia in the geopolitical context is one of the most fascinating ones. But to state the obvious, Armenia is a landlocked country. Its only access, apart from air, used to be through Batum in Georgia onto the Black Sea. However, I've noticed recently that the relationships between Iran and Armenia are getting closer. And I've seen, when I've been in Yerevan, many Iranian people coming backwards and forwards. I think quite clearly Armenia has to have its access, its route outside. Yes. Now, for me, I've often thought that if you can't export goods, if you can't export materials or manufactures, you can export intelligence. Every single school in Armenia teaches, in primary school, they teach chess. Yeah. I think there's a cyber economy emerging there. When I've been to Yerevan, I've seen 15 or 20 different radio stations, and there's an online information disseminator, and a lot of them are online. And I can see the knowledge economy becoming so crucial in that country. So it may not be crates of goods that are being exported, though I think there are 7 British companies currently in Armenia, and I hope one day that there will be 70. But ultimately, this geopolitically, Armenia is in a very difficult position of being unable to ignore the presence of Russia. Yes. You cannot pretend Russia is not there. You cannot trust entirely Georgia, which should be a natural ally. And there's still the marvellous train that goes from Tbilisi to Yerevan overnight. There are still close links there. You cannot deny that Azerbaijan and Turkey are next to it, and you cannot deny Iran. Armenia is where it is, and it has to make the most of what it's got. I happen to think that somehow the Armenian genius, which has survived for so many thousand years, will thrive, and even under these most unpropitious of circumstances, somehow Armenia will do it, because frankly, Armenia is Armenia. It's like no other place on earth. I had my last debate on the floor of the House of Commons about Armenia, and principally about Nagorno-Karabakh, but particularly about recognition of genocide. I've had this debate many, many times, and I'm not going to stop. I'm going to carry on because I owe it to Armenia, and this country owes it to the Armenian people.